The courtroom was filled with laughter. Judge William Reynolds leaned back in his grand leather chair, shaking his head with amusement. "This is ridiculous," he said, smirking as he looked down at the elderly woman standing before him. She was dressed in a simple gray suit, her silver hair tied in a neat bun. Her veined and wrinkled hands rested on the wooden table in front of her. "Ma'am," Judge Reynolds said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "are you lost? This is a court of law, not a book club. Did you wander in here looking for your grandkids?" The laughter in the courtroom grew louder. Some of the younger lawyers exchanged smirks. Even the bailiff had to clear his throat to stop himself from chuckling. But the elderly woman didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply stood there, calm and composed, her eyes sharp and unshaken as she stared straight at the judge. Judge Reynolds scoffed. "You actually think you can defend yourself in this case? An old woman like you? I mean, do you even know how to argue in a courtroom?" And then something changed. The woman took a deep breath, slowly and deliberately adjusting the lapels of her jacket. Then, in a voice that was steady and firm, she said, "Your Honor, I strongly advise you to choose your words carefully." The entire room fell silent. A nervous whisper rippled through the gallery. Even the cocky young attorneys in the front row shifted in their seats, sensing something unusual. Judge Reynolds chuckled, though it sounded more forced now. "Oh, and why is that?" The elderly woman leaned forward slightly. "Because I've won more cases than you have ever presided over, Judge Reynolds," she said coolly, "and you just made a very big mistake." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Someone dropped a pen. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Judge Reynolds' smirk faded. Who was this woman? 2 days earlier, the sun was shining brightly over Chicago. People rushed up and down the sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, checking their phones, lost in their own worlds. At a small cafe on Michigan Avenue, Margaret Holloway stirred a packet of sugar into her tea. She wasn't in a rush. She never was. Life had taught her that moving fast didn't always mean getting ahead. As she took a sip, she overheard 2 young lawyers sitting at the table beside her. "I'm telling you, this case is a guaranteed win," one of them said, grinning. "That old woman doesn't stand a chance. It's open and shut." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she continued sipping her tea. "Judge Reynolds is going to tear her apart," the other young lawyer laughed. "He's ruthless. You saw how he treated that nervous law student last month. What do you think he's going to do to some retired grandmother?" Margaret calmly set her teacup down. She had heard enough. Standing up, she adjusted her blazer and walked out of the cafe, her heels clicking against the pavement. She wasn't just some retired grandmother. She was Margaret Holloway, and she had a case to win. Over the next several hours, Margaret sat at her old wooden desk in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Her eyes scanned every detail. Her hands moved methodically, highlighting important sections. She was preparing for battle. Later that evening, as the city lights twinkled outside her window, she received a phone call. "Ma'am, I hope you know what you're doing," a hesitant voice said. It was her assistant, Andrew. He was young, fresh out of law school, and full of nerves. "Judge Reynolds doesn't respect anyone, especially not someone like you." Margaret smiled. "Like me?" she asked. Andrew cleared his throat awkwardly. "I mean, someone experienced. He's going to underestimate you. Everyone is." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what I want." The next morning, she walked into the courthouse, her back straight, her chin high. Every step she took was measured and deliberate. People whispered. Lawyers glanced at her with amusement. The bailiff looked confused when she approached. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked. Margaret handed him a neatly folded document. "I believe I am," she said with a small smile. Moments later, the courtroom doors opened, and she stepped inside. And that was when it all began. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, smirking. The courtroom burst into laughter. "Are you lost?" A foolish mistake, one he was about to regret. A thick silence swallowed the courtroom. Judge Reynolds' confident smirk wavered, but he quickly recovered, straightening his posture. His pride wouldn't allow him to be intimidated by an elderly woman, no matter how fierce she looked. "Excuse me," he said, feigning amusement. "Did you just suggest I made a mistake?" Margaret clasped her hands in front of her, calm as ever. "I didn't suggest it, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "I stated it as a fact." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even the prosecutor, a sharp man named Jonathan Hayes, looked intrigued. Judge Reynolds let out a dry chuckle, but there was an edge to his tone now. "And what, pray tell, is this so-called big mistake I've made?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if deciding whether he was even worth her time. Then, with careful precision, she said, "Underestimating me." The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Margaret casually turned away and began organizing her files. It was a power move, one that said, "You are not worth my time." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time in years, Judge Reynolds felt something unusual. Doubt. 2 weeks earlier, Margaret was standing in front of her old bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of her legal texts. It had been years since she last stepped into a courtroom, decades, even. But when the notice arrived, a lawsuit filed against her for something she hadn't done, she knew she had no choice. A younger woman might have panicked. A weaker woman might have given up. But Margaret? She simply poured herself a cup of tea and got to work. The case was absurd, a blatant attempt to bully her into submission. A corporation was trying to take away her small property, claiming she had violated a zoning law. It was nothing but greed. They assumed she would fold under the pressure. They assumed wrong. Andrew had begged her to let someone else handle it. "There are plenty of lawyers who can take this on for you," he had said over the phone. Margaret had smiled. "Yes," she had replied, "but none of them are me." Back in the courtroom, Judge Reynolds forced a chuckle. "All right, Miss Holloway, is it?" Margaret gave him a slow nod. Judge Reynolds glanced at his notes. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes." "Are you aware of the charges against you?" "I am." His smirk returned. "Then I assume you're also aware that the law is not something you can just walk into and expect to win." Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "And I assume you're aware that making assumptions in a courtroom is a dangerous thing." A hushed ooh rippled through the audience. The young lawyers in the front row exchanged wide-eyed glances. Judge Reynolds' jaw tightened. He turned to the opposing counsel. "Mr. Hayes, let's begin." Hayes stood, buttoning his expensive navy blue suit. "Of course, Your Honor." He picked up a thick file and walked toward the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a simple case," he began, his voice confident and smooth. "Ms. Holloway is in clear violation of city zoning laws and—" "Objection," Margaret said suddenly, not even looking up from her papers. Hayes faltered. "Excuse me?" Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" Margaret finally raised her gaze, her expression unreadable. "On the grounds that Mr. Hayes just made a false statement." Hayes scoffed. "False? Miss Holloway, the documents clearly show that." "The documents show what you want them to show," Margaret interrupted. "But I'm afraid you miscalculated." Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his patience thinning. "Miss Holloway, you'd better have a solid reason for interrupting the prosecution." Margaret nodded once. Then, with practiced ease, she lifted a single sheet of paper and held it up. "I do." Silence. Judge Reynolds' eyes flickered to the document in her hand. The courtroom waited. Then Margaret calmly said, "And with this, I can prove that everything Mr. Hayes just stated is completely false." Gasps spread across the room like wildfire. Judge Reynolds' face paled. Hayes stiffened. Margaret simply smiled. Checkmate. The entire courtroom was frozen. Judge Reynolds' gaze locked onto the paper in Margaret's hand, his fingers tightening on his gavel. Even the most confident lawyer in the room looked uneasy. Hayes, the prosecutor, took a slow step forward. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Margaret glanced at him, unimpressed. Then, holding the paper higher, she said, "By all means, Mr. Hayes. Come and take a closer look." The silence stretched as Hayes hesitated. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to do. Finally, Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. His pride wouldn't let an elderly woman take control of his courtroom. Miss Holloway, he said, his voice tight, approached the bench. Margaret didn't rush. She moved slowly, deliberately. She had done this walk countless times before. Except back then, no one had dared to underestimate her. She placed the document in front of Judge Reynolds, then stepped back, watching him closely. The judge adjusted his glasses and skimmed the paper. His face changed instantly. His smugness disappeared. His smirk dropped. His lips parted slightly as he scanned the contents of the document again, as if he had misread it the first time. Hayes, still standing awkwardly in the middle of the courtroom, finally broke the silence. "Your Honor," he said, shifting nervously, "what does it say?" Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply and sat back in his chair. He tapped the paper once with his finger before slowly turning his eyes toward Margaret. You had this all along?" Margaret gave a small smile. "Of course." Judge Reynolds blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Hayes, growing impatient, rushed forward to grab the document. The moment his eyes scanned the page, his confidence shattered. His face drained of color, his fingers gripping the paper so tightly it almost crumpled. "No," he muttered under his breath. "This can't be right." Margaret's smile widened just slightly. "I assure you, Mr. Hayes," she said smoothly, "it's very much right." 1 month earlier, the sun had barely risen when Margaret arrived at the St. Louis City Records office. It had been years since she had set foot in a place like this, but some habits never faded. She moved with purpose, her keen eyes scanning the shelves, searching. A younger woman behind the counter looked up, confused. Ma'am, can I help you?" Margaret set her leather briefcase on the desk and gave a polite nod. "I need access to zoning records for Elm Street, Lot 482. The woman frowned. "That information is sealed. Only attorneys or government officials can request it." Margaret smiled and slowly reached into her briefcase. A second later, she slid a small black card across the counter. The woman picked it up, glanced at it, then froze. Her mouth fell open. "This is impossible," she whispered. Margaret simply waited. The woman swallowed and stood abruptly. "I'll get the files right away, ma'am." She disappeared into the back, leaving Margaret alone. Margaret took a deep breath and looked around the room. She could already see it. The case unfolding, the arguments being made, the moment everything would come crashing down on those who underestimated her. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about proving a point. Back in the courtroom, Judge Reynolds slowly removed his glasses. "Ms. Holloway," he said carefully, "would you like to explain this?" Margaret turned to face the jury, her voice as steady as ever. "This document," she said, "proves that my property has been exempt from zoning laws for over 30 years. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Hayes' lips parted. But how?" Margaret looked at him as if he were a child struggling with basic arithmetic. "Because," she said simply, "I wrote the exemption myself." Dead silence. Hayes stumbled back a step. Judge Reynolds blinked rapidly, looking back at the paper in disbelief. The entire courtroom was in chaos. People whispered furiously. Others gasped. Even the stenographer had to pause her typing just to process what had been said. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel. "Order." The room slowly quieted, but the tension remained thick. He turned back to Margaret. "You expect me to believe that you," he gestured toward her, as if struggling to comprehend, "personally wrote this exemption decades ago?" Margaret met his gaze without blinking. "Yes, Your Honor. Because at the time, I was the city's chief zoning attorney." The courtroom exploded. People jumped from their seats. Lawyers turned to each other in disbelief. Hayes looked like he might actually faint. And Judge Reynolds, for the first time in his entire career, had no words. Gasps and whispers flooded the air as people tried to process what they had just heard. Even the young attorneys sitting in the front row, who had been smirking earlier, now looked stunned. Judge Reynolds' gavel slammed down. "Order." I said order. Slowly, the murmurs died down, but the tension in the room remained thick. Judge Reynolds turned to Margaret, his fingers tightening around the wooden gavel. "Ms. Holloway," he said, voice measured, "are you telling this court that you personally wrote the zoning exemption for your own property?" Margaret gave a slight nod. "Not just my property," she corrected. her voice calm. "I wrote exemptions for several properties when I was serving as the city's chief zoning attorney. This was over 3 decades ago, back when the city was still developing its modern zoning laws." Judge Reynolds looked down at the document again, his forehead creased with disbelief. If this is true, why wasn't this presented before? Margaret clasped her hands behind her back, because no one bothered to look. Another wave of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Hayes' face was turning red, not out of anger, but embarrassment. He had walked into this trial believing he was about to crush an old woman. Instead, he was being humiliated in front of everyone. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is highly irregular." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What's irregular, Your Honor? That an elderly woman knows the law better than you?" A collective oof came from the gallery. Even the stenographer suppressed a smirk. Judge Reynolds' eyes darkened. "Watch yourself, Ms. Holloway." But Margaret didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been watching myself for over 60 years, and I've done just fine." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Judge Reynolds' grip on his gavel tightened. He was losing control of the courtroom, and he knew it. Hayes suddenly stepped forward, desperate to regain the upper hand. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "even if this exemption is real, we can't just take her word for it. We need to verify its authenticity." Margaret gave a small shrug. "By all means, verify it. But while you do, I'd also suggest pulling my employment records." She turned slightly, addressing the jury now. "Because when you do, you'll find that I wasn't just any attorney." She let that sentence linger for a moment before adding, "I was the youngest chief zoning attorney in this city's history." More gasps, more murmurs. Judge Reynolds' expression darkened. He wasn't just being humiliated. His entire authority was crumbling in real time. Hayes swallowed hard. This doesn't change the fact that the laws may have changed since then." Margaret smiled. "They have," she admitted. "But my exemption was grandfathered in, which means it still stands." Hayes had no response. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but nothing came out. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. He knew she was right. The law was clear, and if what she was saying was true, then there was no case against her. He turned to Hayes. "Do you have any further arguments?" Hayes' face burned with frustration, but after a long pause, he shook his head. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Margaret simply smiled. Just as the courtroom began to settle, something unexpected happened. The side doors burst open, and a man in a dark suit rushed inside, his expression grim, his movements urgent. He whispered something to the bailiff, who immediately walked over to Judge Reynolds. The judge leaned forward as the bailiff murmured in his ear. The change in his expression was instant. His face turned pale. His grip on his gavel loosened. And then, slowly, he turned back to Margaret, his eyes wide with something no one had ever seen before. Fear. The courtroom held its breath. What had just happened? And why did it seem like, for the first time ever, Judge Reynolds was afraid? The entire courtroom held its breath. Judge Reynolds, the man known for his sharp tongue and unshakable authority, suddenly looked rattled. His grip on the gavel had loosened. His confident smirk had disappeared. And for the first time in his long career, he seemed genuinely unsure of what to do next. The man in the dark suit, clearly someone important, stood silently near the doorway, watching the judge expectantly. Margaret remained still, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She had been in enough courtrooms to know when something wasn't right. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat and adjusted his robe. "We are going to take a brief recess." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. A recess? In the middle of a case? That wasn't normal. Hayes frowned. "Your Honor, with all due respect, why?" The look Judge Reynolds gave him shut him up immediately. "This court is in recess," the judge repeated, his voice strained. He banged his gavel, harder than necessary. 15 minutes. The courtroom erupted in whispers as people stood, some stretching, others exchanging puzzled glances. Margaret, however, didn't move. She simply watched. Judge Reynolds leaned toward the bailiff and muttered something under his breath before standing and stepping down from his bench. Without another word, He followed the man in the dark suit through a side door. Hayes shot Margaret a suspicious look before rushing after them. Margaret allowed herself a small smirk. "Something has rattled them," she murmured. Her young assistant, Andrew, hurried to her side. "Miss Holloway, what's going on?" he whispered. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she adjusted her jacket. Finally, she said, "They just found something." Andrew swallowed. "Something about you?" Margaret turned her gaze toward the door Judge Reynolds had disappeared through. "Without a doubt," she murmured. 15 minutes earlier. Inside Judge Reynolds' private chambers, tension filled the air. The man in the dark suit stood with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Judge Reynolds paced the room, his face pale. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" The man nodded. "We double-checked the records. She is exactly who she says she is." Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "I just made a complete fool of myself in there." Hayes, who had rushed in moments earlier, looked between them in confusion. "Excuse me, what's going on?" The man in the dark suit handed Hayes a file. "Read this." Hayes snatched the file and flipped it open. His eyes skimmed the pages. After a few seconds, his entire body stiffened. "This can't be real," he whispered. Judge Reynolds gave a humorless chuckle. "Oh, it's real." Hayes' hands tightened around the file. "How is this even possible? How did we not know?" The man in the suit sighed. "Because she disappeared from the public eye decades ago. After she retired, she erased herself from the legal world. No interviews, no articles, no public statements. She just vanished." Hayes swallowed hard. "But why?" Judge Reynolds shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" He exhaled sharply. "But right now, we have a bigger problem." Hayes looked up. "Which is?" Judge Reynolds' face darkened. "I mocked her. In open court." Hayes' stomach dropped. This wasn't just about losing a case anymore. They had disrespected her. And that was a mistake they would live to regret. Back in the courtroom, Margaret sat patiently, her hands folded in her lap. She had been underestimated before. She had been dismissed before. But what people failed to realize was that she never walked into a courtroom unprepared. And if Judge Reynolds and Hayes thought they could undo their mistakes with a 15-minute recess, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. When the doors to the judge's chambers finally opened, everyone turned. Judge Reynolds re-entered the courtroom. But something was different. The arrogance was gone. The smirk was gone. Instead, he looked humbled. Hayes followed behind him, his face stiff with discomfort. Judge Reynolds sat down, adjusted his robe, and cleared his throat. "This court will now reconvene." Silence fell. He turned to Margaret, and for the first time since the trial began, his voice was steady. "Miss Holloway," he said slowly, "before we proceed, I'd like to ask you a question." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Judge Reynolds hesitated. Then, with careful precision, he asked, "Why did you walk away from law all those years ago?" The entire courtroom went still. It was an unexpected question, a deeply personal one, and for the first time, Margaret's expression changed, just slightly. She exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the table. "That's not relevant to this case, Your Honor." Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Maybe not, but I'd still like to know." The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. And in a voice quieter than before, she said, "I walked away because I learned that justice doesn't always win." The words hit the courtroom like a punch. Even Judge Reynolds seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Andrew, sitting beside Margaret, looked at her with quiet concern. But before anyone could ask her to elaborate, Margaret leaned forward slightly, her sharpness returning. "But that was a long time ago," she continued. "And right now, we have a case to finish, don't we?" Judge Reynolds studied her for a moment longer. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes, we do." He turned to Hayes. "Does the prosecution have anything else to present?" Hayes looked as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. His face was tense, his body stiff. But after a long pause, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. No, Your Honor. Judge Reynolds nodded again. Then he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, given the evidence presented today, I see no reason to prolong this case any further. The entire courtroom tensed. The moment had arrived. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses, took a breath, and said, "This court rules in favor of Ms. Margaret Holloway." A stunned silence followed. And then, applause. Gasps. Cheers. Margaret, as always, remained composed. She simply let out a slow breath, her lips twitching in the faintest hint of a smile. Andrew, sitting beside her, grinned. "You did it," he whispered. Margaret glanced at him. "Of course I did," she murmured. "I never lose." Across the room, Judge Reynolds rubbed his temples. He had walked into this case thinking he was the most powerful person in the room. Now, he knew better. As the courtroom erupted into noise, Hayes turned toward Margaret, his face still stunned. And in a quiet voice, he asked, "Who are you?" Margaret stood, gathering her things. She glanced at him with a knowing look. Then, in a voice filled with quiet amusement, she simply said, "Someone you should have done your research on." And with that, she walked out of the courtroom, victorious. The courthouse doors swung shut behind Margaret, sealing in the murmurs, whispers, and stunned silence she had left in her wake. Andrew hurried to keep up with her as she strode down the long marble hallway, her heels clicking with quiet confidence. "Miss Holloway," he panted, gripping his notepad tightly. "That was incredible. I mean, I knew you were good, but that was something else." Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. "It was expected." Andrew blinked. "Expected?" Margaret stopped walking. She turned to face him, her sharp eyes studying his eager, youthful expression. "Andrew, let me tell you something," she said. "The moment I walked into that courtroom, I already knew how this case would end." Andrew's brow furrowed. "But how? You couldn't have predicted Judge Reynolds' reaction. You couldn't have known that man in the suit would interrupt." Margaret gave a soft chuckle. "Oh, I didn't predict their reactions." She started walking again. "But I knew their type." Andrew hurried after her. "Judge Reynolds thrives on power. He loves control. But his greatest weakness?" She glanced at him. "He never considered the possibility that someone like me, a woman past her so-called prime, could outmatch him." Andrew nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "So you let them underestimate you?" Margaret nodded. "Exactly. And when people underestimate you—" She paused, then said simply, "They make mistakes." She reached the courthouse steps and inhaled the crisp afternoon air. This wasn't just about winning a case, Andrew. It was about proving a point. Andrew hesitated. "And did you prove it?" Margaret's lips twitched into a smirk. "Oh, they'll be talking about this for years." But just as they stepped onto the sidewalk, a voice called out from behind them. "Ms. Holloway." Margaret turned. Judge Reynolds stood at the top of the courthouse steps, his expression unreadable. His robe had been removed, leaving him in a crisp white shirt and black slacks. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Judge Reynolds took a slow step forward. "I owe you an apology." Andrew's eyebrows shot up. Margaret remained impassive. "Oh." Judge Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I misjudged you. Badly." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "That's true." He let out a dry chuckle. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Should I?" Reynolds sighed again. He shoved his hands into his pockets. "Look, I've spent my entire career believing I could read people the moment they walked into my courtroom." He hesitated. "But today, I realized something." Margaret waited. "I realized," Reynolds continued, his voice quieter now, "that I don't know half as much as I thought I did." The admission was unexpected. Andrew glanced at Margaret, waiting to see her reaction. For a long moment, she simply studied Judge Reynolds. Then she took a step closer. Her voice was calm and even. "Power doesn't come from a title, Your Honor," she said. "It comes from knowledge, from experience, and most of all," she paused, "from respect." She let that sink in. Then, with quiet finality, she added, "I suggest you start giving it to the right people." Judge Reynolds nodded slowly. I will. A beat of silence passed. Then Margaret gave him the faintest of nods. Good. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Andrew hurried to catch up. Do you think he'll change? He asked quietly. Margaret exhaled. Maybe. Andrew thought for a moment. Would you ever consider going back to practicing law? I mean. Margaret gave a small, wistful smile. I don't need a courtroom to practice law, Andrew. She glanced up at the towering skyline of St. Louis. This city, she murmured, is one big courtroom. But just as they reached the curb, a black car pulled up beside them. The window rolled down. A familiar voice drifted out. Margaret Holloway. Still causing trouble, I see. Margaret's smile vanished. Andrew frowned. Who is that? Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a slow breath and turned toward the car. Sitting inside, watching her with an all-too-familiar smirk, was a face she hadn't seen in decades. A face she never thought she'd see again. And just like that, everything changed. Margaret's pulse remained steady, but something in her chest tightened. The man in the car smirked, resting an elbow on the door. His dark eyes gleamed with the same cocky confidence they always had. Well, I wasn't sure you'd still be around after all these years. But here you are, still making headlines. Andrew glanced at Margaret, then back at the man. Miss Holloway, who is this? Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer, peering into the car. Lucas Calloway. Her voice was quiet, measured. The smirk on the man's face deepened. Ah, so you do remember me. Andrew's eyebrows furrowed. Lucas Calloway. Why does that name sound familiar? Calloway chuckled, his gaze never leaving Margaret. That's because, kid, I used to be a very big deal. He turned back to Margaret. And if I recall correctly, you were the one who ruined it for me. Andrew stiffened. Wait, you're Lucas Calloway? The former district attorney? Calloway's grin widened. Bingo. Andrew's face paled. But you were disbarred. Calloway shrugged lazily. What can I say? Some people didn't like how I handled things. Isn't that right, Margaret? Margaret's jaw tightened. You weren't just disliked, Calloway. You were a fraud. A liar. You put innocent people behind bars, and you profited off of it. Calloway sighed, feigning disappointment. Always so dramatic. Andrew took a small step closer to Margaret, lowering his voice. Miss Holloway, is this the man you walked away from law for? Calloway's smirk didn't falter. Margaret didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Calloway exhaled and leaned back against his seat. I have to admit, watching you take down Reynolds today was fun. Almost nostalgic. His eyes gleamed. You haven't lost your edge? Margaret crossed her arms. What do you want, Calloway? His grin faded slightly. I want to talk. Margaret raised an eyebrow. We have nothing to discuss. Calloway's smile returned, but this time, there was something dark behind it. Oh, I think we do. Because Margaret, I'm back. Andrew stiffened. Back? What does that mean? Margaret's lips pressed together. Calloway's eyes gleamed. It means, sweetheart, he said, turning to Andrew, that I'm not done with this city yet. A heavy silence settled between them. Margaret inhaled slowly. You were disbarred, Calloway. You have no power anymore. Calloway's smile returned. That's what you think. Margaret stared at him, unmoving. Then, finally, Calloway reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He held it out to her. Consider this an invitation, he said. One I strongly suggest you accept. Margaret didn't take it. Calloway chuckled. Still stubborn, I see. He set the envelope on the passenger seat instead. I'll give you some time to think about it. But don't take too long, Margaret. His smile sharpened. Because things are about to get interesting. The car window rolled up, and before Margaret could say another word, the vehicle pulled away, vanishing into the crowded streets of St. Louis. Andrew turned to her, his face pale. Miss Holloway, what just happened? Margaret stared at the spot where Calloway's car had disappeared. Her jaw clenched. War, she murmured. Andrew swallowed. What? She exhaled slowly, her eyes dark. Lucas Calloway is back, she said quietly, and that means this city is in trouble. Andrew hesitated. But if he's disbarred, what can he even do? Margaret turned to face him, her expression unreadable. You don't understand, Andrew. She looked back toward the city skyline, where the sun was beginning to set. Calloway never needed the law to be dangerous. The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Andrew shifted nervously. So, what do we do? Margaret exhaled. Then, with quiet certainty, she said, we stop him. The streets of St. Louis stretched out before Margaret, the hum of car engines and distant chatter filling the air. But she wasn't hearing any of it. Lucas Calloway was back, a name she had spent years trying to forget, a name she once thought had been erased from the legal world forever. Andrew walked beside her, clutching his notepad tightly. Ms. Holloway, he said, glancing at her. What exactly did Calloway mean when he said things are about to get interesting? Margaret exhaled slowly. It means he's planning something. She tightened her grip on her back. And if I know Calloway, it's something dangerous. Andrew frowned. But what can he even do? He lost his law license. He has no power. Margaret's jaw tightened. Calloway never needed a law license to be powerful. Andrew swallowed. What did he do, exactly? Back then, I mean. Margaret stopped walking. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Calloway was one of the most ruthless district attorneys this city has ever seen. Her voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath it. He didn't just win cases. He crushed people. He buried evidence, bribed witnesses, and strong-armed judges into ruling in his favor. Andrew's stomach twisted. That's horrible. Margaret nodded. It was. She looked back toward the street, her thoughts racing. And for years, no one could touch him. Andrew hesitated. Until? Margaret's gaze darkened. Until I did. Andrew's eyes widened. You took him down? Margaret nodded once. It took years of digging, of gathering proof. I had to go up against the entire system. Judges, politicians, corrupt cops. She exhaled sharply. But in the end, I exposed him. I forced him into a corner where he had no way out. Andrew exhaled. And that's why he lost his license. Margaret's lips pressed together. Yes. She looked toward the city lights, her expression unreadable. And I thought that was the end of it. She turned back toward the street, her thoughts racing. Calloway wasn't the type to return without a plan. He wasn't stupid. If he had resurfaced now, after all these years, it meant one thing. He was after something, and she needed to find out what. Just as she was about to speak, Andrew's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and frowned. That's weird. Margaret glanced at him. What is it? Andrew's expression tightened. I just got a news alert. He hesitated. Judge Reynolds has been hospitalized. Margaret stiffened. What? Andrew read quickly. It says he collapsed in his office an hour ago. Doctors are calling it stress-related. But, he hesitated. Margaret's eyes narrowed. But you don't think that's the whole story? Andrew swallowed. It's just, don't you think the timing is strange? Right after you win your case? Right after Calloway shows up? Margaret clenched her fists. Judge Reynolds was arrogant, overconfident, even rude. But he wasn't corrupt. And if he had suddenly fallen ill after Calloway's return, there was only one conclusion to draw. Calloway had already started his game. Margaret inhaled sharply. We need to move. Fast. Andrew blinked. Move fast? Move fast how? Margaret turned toward him, her expression like steel. Calloway isn't just back to settle old grudges, Andrew. Her voice was firm. He's here to take back control of this city. Andrew's blood ran cold. Then, what do we do? Margaret looked up, her sharp gaze scanning the skyline. She knew what needed to be done. We do what we did last time. She exhaled. We take him down. The city lights flickered against the glass of Margaret's apartment window, casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the night pressed down on her shoulders as she sat at her old wooden desk, sifting through decades of memories she had hoped to never revisit. A small pile of documents sat before her, clippings of past court cases, old witness testimonies, and the final report that had led to Lucas Calloway's downfall. She ran a finger along the faded edges of a newspaper headline. Disgraced District Attorney Lucas Calloway disbarred amid corruption scandal. Across from her, Andrew scanned the documents with growing unease. Miss Holloway, this guy was worse than I thought. He picked up a report. Bribery, intimidation, evidence tampering. It's a miracle he didn't end up in prison. Margaret exhaled slowly. Oh, he almost did. She leaned back in her chair. But Calloway was too smart to leave loose ends. Andrew frowned. Then how did you bring him down? Margaret's eyes darkened. I found the one witness he couldn't make disappear. Andrew sat forward. Who? Margaret hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, Me. Andrew's breath hitched. You? She nodded. I had worked with Calloway for years. I had seen his tactics up close. She exhaled. But what finally sealed his fate? Her jaw tightened. Was the case of a man named Thomas Green. Andrew frowned. That name sounds familiar. Margaret clenched her jaw. It should. He was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Andrew's face paled. Calloway framed him? Margaret nodded. Green was an innocent man. Calloway needed a conviction to boost his reputation. So he planted evidence and manipulated the jury. Her voice hardened. And when I realized what had happened, I couldn't stay silent. Andrew leaned back, stunned. So you testified against him? Yes, Margaret said quietly. And it cost me everything. A heavy silence fell between them. Andrew swallowed. Is that why you left law? Margaret exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. When you take down a man like Calloway, you don't just ruin his career. You make enemies. Powerful ones. She tapped the desk. After the trial, my life became difficult. I was threatened, watched. I lost friends, colleagues. I realized that no matter how much I fought for justice, corruption would always find a way back. Andrew frowned. So you walked away? Margaret nodded. I thought if I disappeared, Calloway's influence would disappear with me. Her jaw tightened. But I was wrong. Andrew sat in silence for a moment. Then, carefully, he asked, if you could go back, would you do it again? Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes. Andrew exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. You really are something else, Miss Holloway. A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. So I've been told. Just then, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Andrew jumped. Are you expecting someone? Margaret frowned. No. She stood and crossed the room, her movements careful. With a steady breath, she peered through the peephole. Her stomach dropped. Standing on the other side of the door, dressed in a sleek black suit, was a man she hadn't seen in years. Andrew noticed her stiffen. Who is it? Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. An old ghost. She unlatched the door and pulled it open. The man on the other side smiled. Hello, Margaret. Her expression remained cold. Samuel Drake. Andrew tensed. Who's Samuel Drake? The man chuckled, stepping into the dimly lit room. I'm the man who used to clean up Calloway's messes. Andrew's breath hitched. You. Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. What do you want, Drake? Drake sighed, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Come now, Margaret. No small talk? No catching up? Margaret's eyes narrowed. Get to the point. Drake smirked. Fine. Calloway sent me. Andrew's stomach twisted. Calloway? Drake nodded. He wanted me to deliver a message. Margaret crossed her arms. I don't take messages from criminals. Drake chuckled. Oh, but this one's special. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. He says, you should have stayed gone. A heavy silence fell over the room. Andrew swallowed hard. Is that a threat? Drake shrugged. Call it a warning. He stepped back, his smirk never fading. You should know better than anyone, Margaret. Calloway doesn't like unfinished business. Margaret remained unfazed. Tell Calloway that if he wants to talk, he can do it himself. Drake's smile widened. Oh, don't worry. You'll be seeing him soon enough. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving only the echo of his footsteps behind. Andrew let out a shaky breath. Miss Holloway, he hesitated. What do we do now? Margaret turned, her gaze hard as steel. We don't wait for Calloway to make the next move. She picked up her coat. We make it first. The night air was crisp, wrapping around Margaret and Andrew as they stepped onto the busy St. Louis sidewalk. The city never slept, but tonight it felt different, heavier, charged with an invisible tension Margaret knew all too well. Andrew pulled his coat tighter around him, his nervous energy obvious. "Miss Holloway, are we really doing this? Going after Calloway before he makes a move?" Margaret's pace was steady, purposeful. "We don't have a choice, Andrew. If we wait, he controls the game." She glanced at him. "And Calloway never plays fair." Andrew exhaled. "Okay, so where do we start?" Margaret hailed a cab and slid inside, Andrew following close behind. As the driver pulled away from the curb, Margaret spoke 2 words. "Thomas Green." Andrew blinked. "Wait, the guy Calloway framed? But isn't he still in prison?" Margaret nodded, her jaw tight. "Yes." She looked out the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "And that's exactly why we need to talk to him." 40 minutes later, Rikers Correctional Facility. The fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over the visitor's room. Margaret and Andrew sat at a cold metal table, waiting. The door on the other side of the glass buzzed open. A tall, tired-looking man in an orange jumpsuit stepped in. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His once strong frame was now worn down by time and circumstance. Thomas Green. His eyes locked onto Margaret the moment he saw her. A flicker of something passed through them. Recognition, curiosity, maybe even resentment. He took a seat across from them, picking up the phone on his side of the glass. Margaret did the same. "You got some nerve coming here, Holloway," he said, his voice rough from years of silence. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I know." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What do you want?" Margaret's voice was steady. "Calloway is back." Thomas stilled. His grip on the phone tightened. His jaw clenched. "He's back?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Margaret nodded. "And I need to know what he's planning." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "You think I know?" He shook his head. "I've been locked up for 30 years because of that man. He hasn't spoken my name since the day he had me put away." Andrew, sitting beside Margaret, hesitated. "But if Calloway was willing to ruin your life to protect himself back then, don't you think he'd still be keeping tabs on you now?" Thomas exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I don't know what he's up to." His voice lowered. "But if he's back in the city, it's bad news for everyone." Margaret studied him carefully. "What was the last thing Calloway said to you before your conviction?" Thomas's jaw tightened. He glanced away for a moment, lost in old memories. Then, quietly, he said, "He told me I was a loose end." Andrew frowned. "A loose end?" Thomas nodded. "He didn't just want me convicted." His voice was bitter now. "He wanted me erased. He told me the world would forget my name." Margaret's fingers tapped against the table thoughtfully. Calloway had always been calculated. He didn't make reckless moves. Everything was precise, intentional. If he had returned now, after all these years, it meant something had changed. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to finish something. Margaret took a deep breath. "Thomas." She hesitated. "If I find a way to prove your innocence." Thomas let out a dry laugh. "Don't bother, Holloway." His voice was flat. "No one cares about an old case." Margaret's expression didn't change. "I care." Thomas studied Margaret for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed, leaning closer to the glass. "There's one thing you need to know, Margaret." Margaret and Andrew leaned in. "Calloway wasn't working alone back then," Thomas said quietly. "There were people in high places protecting him." Andrew's brow furrowed. "Who?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know all their names, but I do know one thing." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "They never left." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Andrew swallowed. "You're saying there are still people in power covering for him?" Thomas nodded. "And if Calloway's back, it means they want him back." The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about an old enemy resurfacing. This was bigger. Margaret exhaled, setting down the phone. "Thank you, Thomas." Thomas gave her a tired look. "Don't thank me." His voice was low, serious. "Just finish what you started." Margaret stood. Andrew hesitated before following her. As they walked toward the exit, Andrew turned to her. "Miss Holloway, what do we do now?" Margaret's expression was unreadable. Then, quietly, she said, "We find the people pulling Calloway's strings." She stepped through the doors, her mind racing. Calloway was dangerous, but the ones hiding in the shadows, the ones who had kept him protected all these years, they were worse. And now, she was going to expose them, no matter what it took. The cold night air clung to Margaret as she and Andrew exited Rikers Correctional Facility. The weight of Thomas Green's words sat heavy between them. They never left. The idea that Calloway had been part of something bigger, that powerful people had kept him hidden all these years, sent a sharp pulse of unease through Margaret's chest. Andrew broke the silence first. "Miss Holloway, if what Green said is true, we're not just dealing with Calloway anymore." His voice was low. "We're dealing with everyone who protected him." Margaret nodded, her expression hard. "That's exactly right." Andrew swallowed. "So where do we even start? How do you track down people who've stayed hidden for 30 years? Margaret's answer was immediate. "We follow the money." Andrew blinked. "Money?" Margaret turned to him. "Corrupt men don't disappear, Andrew. They shift. They change positions." Her eyes darkened. "But one thing always remains the same." Andrew frowned. "They protect their wealth." He exhaled. "Okay, but Calloway lost everything when he was disbarred. He doesn't have money anymore, right?" Margaret gave him a knowing look. "Do you really believe that?" Andrew hesitated. Calloway had been one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state. A man like him didn't just walk away with nothing. Andrew sighed. "All right. So, how do we track his money?" Margaret's eyes darkened. "We talked to someone who knows how to find it." Midnight, downtown St. Louis. A dimly lit warehouse stood at the end of a deserted alley, its rusted metal door barely holding onto its hinges. Andrew looked around, clearly nervous. "Miss Holloway, are you sure this is a good idea?" Margaret stepped up to the door and knocked 3 times in a precise rhythm. "Not particularly." Andrew groaned. "Great. That makes me feel so much better." After a long pause, the door creaked open. A lean, sharp-eyed man in his late 40s stood there. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, and he wore a leather jacket that looked older than Andrew. The man's gaze flickered to Margaret. A slow smirk spread across his face. "Well, well." He leaned against the doorframe. "If it isn't Margaret Holloway." Margaret crossed her arms. "Hello, Vincent." Vincent let out a low chuckle. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." His eyes drifted to Andrew. "And who's the kid?" Andrew bristled. "I'm not a kid." Margaret sighed. "Vincent, we don't have time for small talk. We need your help." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "My help? I don't do charity work, Holloway." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "This isn't charity. It's business." Vincent's smirk faded slightly. "I'm listening." Margaret took a step closer. "We need to track down Calloway's money." Vincent's smirk disappeared instantly. His posture straightened, his face suddenly serious. "Calloway?" His voice dropped lower. "You're telling me Lucas Calloway is back?" Margaret nodded once. Vincent let out a low whistle. "Well, damn." Andrew frowned. "So, you knew he had money stashed away?" Vincent snorted. "Of course he did. You think a guy like that wouldn't have backup funds?" He shook his head. "I always suspected he had offshore accounts." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "Can you find them?" Vincent hesitated. "Maybe, but it won't be easy. Calloway's people are careful. If he's back, then whoever's backing him has already moved the money." Andrew ran a hand through his hair. "So, what do we do?" Vincent sighed, rubbing his jaw. "There's one way. A dangerous way." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Vincent hesitated, then finally said, "We find Calloway's old banker." Andrew frowned. "Wait, he had a personal banker?" Vincent nodded. "Of course he did. Every corrupt politician and criminal does. And if Calloway still has access to his money, there's only one guy who could have handled it." He paused. "David Langston." Margaret's expression turned cold. Andrew looked between them. "Wait, who's David Langston?" Vincent exhaled. "Langston used to be one of the biggest financial fixers in the Midwest. If Calloway needed to launder money, hide assets, or move funds under the radar, Langston was the guy who made it happen. Andrew frowned. So, where do we find him? Vincent smirked. That's the fun part. Margaret crossed her arms. Vincent. Vincent chuckled. Relax, Holloway. I know where he is. Margaret's voice was firm. Then tell me. Vincent leaned in slightly, his smirk fading. Langston's not in some fancy office anymore, Margaret. After Calloway fell, he disappeared. He paused. The only reason I know where he is? He chuckled. It's because he owes me a favor. Andrew shifted nervously. And where is he now? Vincent's smirk returned. The only place a disgraced banker goes when he's got nowhere left to run. Margaret sighed. Let me guess. Vincent grinned. Las Vegas. Andrew groaned. Oh, great. This just keeps getting better. Margaret turned to Vincent. We leave in the morning. Vincent held up his hands. Hey, I'm not the one going after a ghost, Holloway. But if you want to find Calloway's money? He smirked. Langston is the key. Margaret nodded. Then we have work to do. The drive was quiet, save for the occasional sound of Andrew fidgeting with his seatbelt. Margaret's mind was focused. Calloway's return had set a chain of events in motion. If he had resurfaced, it meant his people, the same ones who had protected him for years, were still watching, still waiting. And if Calloway was moving money again, then someone had given him permission. Andrew let out a long breath. Ms. Holloway, what happens if we actually find this money? Margaret's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then we'll know exactly who's backing him. Andrew hesitated. And then? Margaret's eyes darkened. Then we bring them down. The car sped down the highway, the neon glow of Las Vegas rising in the distance. Calloway had come back to reclaim his power, but Margaret was about to remind him why he lost it in the first place. The neon lights of Las Vegas flickered like artificial stars against the early evening sky. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation, two things Margaret had always associated with the city. She parked the car in a dark alley near the Strip, glancing at Andrew and Vincent. We go in, we find Langston, we get the information we need, and we leave. No unnecessary risks. Vincent chuckled. You say that like anything about this isn't a risk? Margaret shot him a sharp look. Just lead us to him. Vincent smirked but nodded, stepping out of the car. Andrew adjusted his jacket nervously. I don't like this. If Langston's still alive, it means Calloway's people let him stay alive. That means they're watching him. Margaret shut the car door and exhaled. I know. She knew this wasn't just about tracking Calloway's money anymore. This was about exposing the people behind him, the ones who had kept him protected, hidden, funded. They stepped onto the Strip, moving past flashing billboards and swarms of tourists throwing their money away at the casinos. Vincent led them into a quieter part of town, stopping outside a rundown lounge with a flickering red sign. Langston's last known location, Vincent said. He'll be in the back. He doesn't like visitors, so don't expect a warm welcome. Margaret pushed open the door without hesitation. The place smelled of stale whiskey and regret. A few men sat hunched over their drinks, uninterested in anything beyond their own misfortunes. At the far end of the room, a man in a wrinkled suit sat alone, swirling a glass of bourbon. His hair had thinned, and his once expensive clothes now looked cheap. But Margaret recognized him instantly. David Langston. She walked toward him, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down. Langston barely glanced up. Whatever you want, I don't have it. Margaret leaned forward. I think you do. His eyes flicked to hers. For a brief moment, there was something like recognition, then realization. His grip on his glass tightened. Holloway. His voice was hoarse. You shouldn't be here. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. Neither should you. Langston exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You don't get it. If Calloway knows you're looking for me, you're already dead. Andrew shifted uncomfortably. We need to know where his money is. Langston let out a dry laugh. You think I have access to that? He shook his head. I was cut off years ago. Margaret's voice was calm but firm. But you still know where it was. Langston hesitated. Margaret leaned in slightly. You don't have much time, Langston. If Calloway's back, He's not leaving loose ends. Her voice lowered. And right now, you're one of them. Langston's hands trembled slightly as he took another sip of his drink. I don't have records. I don't have accounts. He swallowed hard. But his voice dropped to a whisper. I know where the last of his money was hidden. Margaret's eyes sharpened. Where? Langston exhaled, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. Then, in a hushed voice, he muttered, The Haven Trust. Andrew frowned. Never heard of it. Langston let out another bitter chuckle. That's because it doesn't exist. Not on paper, anyway. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. It's a shadow bank, run by Calloway's real allies. Margaret's stomach tightened. Who runs it? Langston hesitated again. Then, finally, he whispered a name. Margaret's entire body went cold. Andrew looked between them. Who? Who is it? Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Senator Richard Hale. Andrew's mouth fell open. The Senator Richard Hale? Langston nodded, his face tight with fear. Hale has been pulling the strings for years. Calloway was just a pawn. And if Hale's bringing him back? He swallowed. It means he's planning something big. Margaret clenched her fists. Where's the bank located? Langston's hands shook slightly as he reached into his jacket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, sliding it across the table. Margaret unfolded it. An address was scrawled in ink. Andrew leaned over. That's right here in Las Vegas. Langston's voice dropped to a whisper. If you go there, you won't come back. Margaret folded the paper and stood. We'll see about that. She turned to leave, but Langston grabbed her wrist. His eyes were desperate. If you take him down, Holloway. His voice was almost pleading. Make sure he stays down this time. Margaret nodded. I intend to. The building was unmarked. A sleek glass structure on the waterfront, blending into the city like it had always belonged there. But Margaret knew better. Vincent parked a block away, glancing in the rearview mirror. This is a bad idea. Margaret stepped out. Probably. Andrew followed, his heart pounding. Miss Holloway, this is suicide. Margaret exhaled. If we don't do this, Calloway wins. She walked toward the building, the night swallowing her figure. Inside, the lobby was quiet. Too quiet. A single receptionist sat behind a marble desk, her expression unreadable. Margaret stepped forward. I have an appointment. The woman looked up, unfazed. Name? Margaret smiled coldly. Margaret Holloway. The receptionist barely reacted. Instead, she picked up the phone and murmured something. Then, she looked at Margaret. Go on up. Andrew tensed. He's expecting you? Margaret's jaw tightened. Calloway is waiting. She stepped into the elevator. Andrew by her side. As the doors closed, a sense of finality settled over them. This was it. One way or another. It ended tonight. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a massive office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Las Vegas skyline. And standing in the center of the room, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, was Lucas Calloway. His smirk was slow, confident. Margaret. Margaret didn't blink. Calloway. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. You've been busy. Margaret tilted her head slightly. So have you. Calloway chuckled. You know, when I heard you were back in the game, I wasn't sure if I should be impressed or disappointed. Margaret smiled coldly. Funny. I was thinking the same thing about you. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. You should have stayed gone, Holloway. Margaret's voice was like steel. So should you. Silence stretched between them. Then Calloway smirked. Well, he said, let's see who wins this time. The city lights gleamed outside, and the war began. The sun was rising over Las Vegas, casting golden light across the strip. The battle was over. Lucas Calloway had been taken down again.